He thought the night belonged to him. The ballroom shimmered under cascading crystal chandeliers, each drop of light reflecting off polished marble floors and champagne glasses held by people who measured worth in net value and last names, and at the center of it all stood Ryan Caldwell, perfectly tailored in a midnight black tuxedo, one hand resting confidently at the small of Sophie Hart's back as if she were both his prize and his proof, her silver gown catching every flicker of light as she smiled the kind of smile that had been trained for cameras and admiration, and everywhere they moved, the room adjusted, conversations pausing just slightly, heads turning just enough to acknowledge the couple everyone was expected to notice, expected to envy, expected to remember, and Ryan leaned in just close enough to murmur something into Sophie's ear that made her laugh, a soft, curated sound that echoed just long enough to signal happiness without ever risking sincerity, because tonight wasn't about love, it was about display, about control, about rewriting the narrative he had carefully constructed ever since the divorce papers had been signed, a narrative where he had risen, upgraded, moved forward, while somewhere behind him, the past had quietly faded into irrelevance, or at least, that's what he believed, until the doors opened again, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift in the rhythm of the room, the kind most people wouldn't consciously register, but something subtle changed, a pause too. Soft to name, a breath held just a fraction longer than usual, and Claire Bennett stepped inside, unnoticed in the way that only someone truly out of place could be, wearing a simple navy dress that didn't compete with the room but didn't apologize to it either, her heels clicking softly against the marble as she moved with measured calm, her gaze steady, not searching, not shrinking, just present, and for a moment, no one reacted, not because she was invisible, but because she didn't demand attention the way everything else in the room did. She didn't sparkle, she didn't perform, she didn't announce herself, and yet there was something about her stillness that resisted being ignored, something in the way her hand rested lightly against her abdomen, instinctive, protective, a gesture so small it could be missed if you weren't looking, and Ryan wasn't looking, not yet, he was still smiling. For someone important, still playing the role he had perfected, until Sophie's laughter faltered just slightly, her eyes drifting past him, catching on something unfamiliar, something she couldn't immediately categorize, and that was when Ryan turned, casually at first, the way you turn when you expect nothing, and then not casually at all, because there she was, Claire, standing at the edge of the world he had rebuilt without her, and for the briefest second, something unguarded flickered across his face, gone almost before it could be recognized, replaced quickly by the practiced ease of a man who refused to be unsettled. He straightened, his smile sharpening into something thinner, more deliberate, and as Claire stepped further into the room, the soft hum of conversation seemed to bend around her without quite touching her, like the space itself wasn't sure where to place her, and she didn't rush to fill that uncertainty. She didn't hurry, didn't look for validation, didn't even look at Ryan right away, as if his presence required no immediate acknowledgement, and that, more than anything, was what made the moment feel off, because this was his stage, his story, his carefully curated illusion of control, and yet something about her quiet entrance had introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for, something subtle but undeniable, like a shift in gravity that no one could explain yet everyone could feel, and still, no one understood why, not yet, not even Ryan. Because to him, she was just the past walking into his present, just a woman he had already outgrown, already replaced, already rewritten, and he smiled again, more confidently this time, convinced the night still belonged to him, unaware that the most powerful person in the room had just arrived without making a sound. Ryan recovered quickly, or at least that was what it looked like from the outside, because men like him did not stumble in public, they adjusted, recalibrated, reclaimed control, and he did it with a slow inhale and a sharper smile, his hand pressing just a fraction more firmly against Sophie's back as if to anchor himself to something familiar, something he understood, something he could still display, and Sophie followed his lead, lifting her chin slightly higher, her posture aligning with his as though they were performing a scene they had rehearsed, but her eyes betrayed her for just a moment longer. Then she intended, drifting again toward Claire, who had now moved deeper into the room without urgency, without hesitation, as if she had every right to be there, as if the air itself parted for her in a way that no one had formally announced yet everyone subconsciously accommodated, and that was when the first subtle shift occurred, not loud enough to interrupt the music, not obvious enough to draw collective attention, but noticeable in fragments, a server straightening instinctively as she passed, a man in a tailored suit pausing mid-sentence to follow her movement with a flicker of recognition he could not quite place, a woman near the bar lowering her voice just slightly as Claire approached, as though something about her presence required a recalibration of tone, and still, Claire said nothing, did nothing dramatic, she simply existed within the space in a way that felt deliberate, controlled, and entirely unbothered by the spectacle unfolding around her, her hand again brushing lightly across her abdomen, not as a shield, not as a statement, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something far more important than the room, and Ryan saw it this time, that small gesture, that almost imperceptible detail, and something tightened in his chest, not fear, not yet, but something closer to irritation, because it suggested a narrative he did not own, a story he had not approved, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit, so he did what he always did when confronted with uncertainty, he leaned into performance, turning slightly toward Claire now, making sure his movement was visible, intentional, drawing a few curious glances from those nearby as if to reassert his role as the focal point, and when their eyes finally met, there was no hesitation in hers, no flicker of the old uncertainty he remembered, no trace of the woman he had once convinced himself was smaller without him, instead there was a calmness that felt almost unfamiliar, almost inconvenient, because it did not react to him the way he expected, did not validate his importance, did not acknowledge his carefully constructed superiority, and for a moment, the silence between them stretched just long enough to become noticeable, just long enough for Sophie to shift beside him, her fingers tightening slightly around his arm as if sensing that something invisible was slipping beyond their control, and around them. The room continued its quiet adjustment, conversations subtly reorienting, attention redistributing in ways no one openly addressed, because power did not always announce itself with volume, sometimes it revealed itself in absence, in restraint, in the way a single presence could alter the atmosphere without raising its voice, and Claire remained exactly as she was, composed, still, observing rather than reacting, as though she had already seen this moment play out and found it unremarkable. And Ryan, despite every instinct to dismiss it, to minimize it, to reframe it into something manageable, felt the first undeniable crack in the illusion he had built, because for the first time that evening, he was no longer entirely certain that he understood the room, and Sophie, standing beside him in all her polished perfection, realized something even more unsettling. She was no longer sure that she was the most important woman in it, and neither of them yet understood why. The music did not stop, but something in the room shifted so completely it felt as if it had, because just as Ryan prepared to speak, to reclaim the narrative with a polished remark or a casual dismissal, the host's voice rose above the low hum of conversation, smooth and practiced, carrying across the ballroom with the effortless authority of someone accustomed to being heard, and all attention followed, as it always did, turning toward the stage where the evening's key investors and partners were to be acknowledged, a routine moment, expected, predictable, and yet tonight it carried a weight no one could yet explain, and Ryan exhaled quietly, relieved for the interruption, grateful for the return to structure, to hierarchy, to a system he understood, but Claire did not move away, she did not step back into the shadows, she simply remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as though she had been waiting not for him, but for this, and when the host began listing names, the usual sequence of recognition unfolding with polite applause and measured smiles, Ryan barely listened at first, his focus still divided, still tethered to the quiet disruption standing only a few feet away, until a name cut through the rhythm, not louder than the others, but different in the way it landed, Claire Bennett, and for a fraction of a second, the room did not react, as though it needed time to reconcile the name with the presence already among them, and then the applause came, not hesitant, not confused, but immediate and genuine, because the context followed just as quickly, lead strategic partner in the Blackwood Expansion Initiative, and the words settled into the room like a new gravity, pulling attention fully, undeniably, toward her, and Claire stepped forward then, not with hesitation, not with surprise, but with the same measured calm she had carried since the moment she entered, her hand no longer resting on her abdomen but relaxed at her side, her gaze steady as she acknowledged the room with a slight nod, not seeking approval, not performing gratitude, simply accepting recognition as something already earned, and it was only then that Ryan truly saw her, not as the past he had dismissed, not as the version of her he had rewritten, but as someone entirely outside the narrative he had constructed, someone who no longer required his validation to exist, and beside him, Sophie's posture shifted again, her earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain, because the attention she had been holding so effortlessly was no longer hers, it had moved, decisively, completely, and there was no clear way to reclaim it, and then, as if the moment had not yet reached its full weight, another name followed, introduced not with explanation but with expectation, Ethan Blackwood, and the reaction was immediate, a ripple of recognition. That moved through the crowd with far more intensity, heads turning, conversations halting entirely now, because this was not just another name, this was influence, legacy, power in its most established form, and when he stepped forward from the periphery, composed and unassuming in a way that only amplified his presence, he did not rush to the stage, did not command the room with force. He simply crossed the distance with quiet certainty until he stood beside Claire, close enough to be unmistakable, and without theatrics, without raising his voice, he placed his hand gently at her back, not claiming, not displaying, but aligning, and in that single, understated gesture, the entire story Ryan had been telling himself unraveled, because this was not coincidence, not timing, not luck, this was structure, intention, a reality that had been built without him. And the room understood it before he fully did, the shift complete now, undeniable, irreversible, and Claire, standing in that light, did not look at him, did not acknowledge the tension he carried, because she did not need to, the moment had already spoken for her, and Ryan, for the first time that night, realized that he had never been the center of it, he had simply been standing where the light used to be. Applause lingered a second longer than necessary, not out of politeness but out of recalibration, as if the room itself needed time to settle into this new arrangement of power, and when the sound finally softened into the low hum of resumed conversation, it did not return to what it had been before, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone by louder laughter or brighter smiles. And Ryan felt it in the way people no longer looked at him first, in the way their attention curved past him now, drawn toward Claire and the man standing beside her with effortless authority, and he adjusted his cufflinks slowly, deliberately, a small controlled movement meant to anchor him back into himself, to remind anyone watching that he was still composed, still relevant, still the version of himself he had presented all evening, but the gesture landed differently now, smaller somehow, less convincing, and Sophie sensed it too, her posture no longer perfectly aligned with his, her hand slipping from his arm as she reached instead for a glass of champagne she did not drink, her gaze flickering between Claire and Ethan with a quiet calculation that had replaced her earlier confidence, because admiration in a room like this was never permanent, it was conditional, fluid, always moving toward the strongest current, and tonight, that current had changed direction, and Ryan knew he could not stand still, not now, not when the narrative was slipping beyond his reach, so he stepped forward, closing the distance that had formed between himself and Claire, each step measured, each breath controlled, until he stood close enough to be part of the same frame again, part of the same story, or at least that was his intention, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same smooth edge it always had, polished, deliberate. Claire, he said, as if the name still belonged to him in some way, as if saying it could re-establish a connection that no longer existed, and for a brief moment, the surrounding conversations dimmed again, not because he commanded it, but because people sensed the collision about to happen, the past meeting the present in a way that could not be ignored, and Claire turned her head slightly, acknowledging him without surprise, without hesitation, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that did not invite conflict, did not encourage drama, simply present, and Ryan smiled, just enough to suggest familiarity, just enough to imply that whatever had just been revealed did not unsettle him. I did not realize you were involved in this level of work, he continued, his tone light, almost conversational, but there was something beneath it, something sharper, an attempt to reframe, to diminish without appearing to do so, to place her back into a version of the past he could control, and Claire listened without interruption, her silence not passive but intentional, allowing his words to exist without granting them weight. And then she answered, her voice steady, even, carrying just far enough to be heard by those closest. There is a lot you did not realize, she said, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, simply as a fact, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than anything louder could have, because it did not seek to wound, it did not seek to prove, it simply existed as truth, and beside her, Ethan did not intervene, did not assert himself. His presence alone enough to reinforce what did not need to be spoken, and Ryan felt it then, fully, the loss of control he could not disguise, not in the way people were watching now, not in the way Sophie had gone quiet beside him, not in the way the room had already moved on from him without asking permission, and for the first time that evening, his smile faltered, not completely, not enough to be called out, but enough for those paying attention to notice, and Claire, seeing it, did not press further, did not escalate, because she did not need to. The moment had already done what it needed to do, and as she turned slightly back toward the room, rejoining the flow of conversation now centered around her, it became clear to everyone watching that this was not a confrontation she had come to win, it was simply a reality she had stepped into, fully, quietly, and without apology, leaving Ryan standing in a version of the night that no longer belonged to him. The room did not erupt, it did not fracture into whispers or spectacle, instead it settled into something far more telling, a quiet realignment where conversations resumed but no longer circled the same center, where glances no longer checked for Ryan's reaction before forming opinions, and where Claire, without raising her voice or claiming space, had become the point everything else adjusted around, and she moved through it now with the same calm precision, acknowledging a question here, offering a measured response there, her presence neither overwhelming nor seeking attention, yet impossible to ignore, because it carried something deeper than performance, something rooted, earned, unshaken, and Ethan remained beside her not as a shield but as a parallel force, his attention selective, his words few, allowing the room to come to her rather than positioning her within it, and that, more than anything, defined the difference, because Ryan had always stepped forward to be seen, while Claire no longer needed to, and across the floor, Ryan stood still for a moment longer than he intended, his mind catching up to what had already become obvious to everyone else, that the version of the evening he had constructed was no longer the dominant narrative, and Sophie shifted beside him again, this time not out of discomfort but calculation, her eyes scanning the room with a different kind of awareness, recognizing the shift in attention as something tangible, something measurable, and for the first time since they had arrived, she stepped slightly away from him, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to create a subtle distance that spoke volumes in a room trained to read between movements, and Ryan noticed, of course he did, because control for him had always extended beyond himself, into the perception of others, into the alignment of those who stood beside him, and that alignment was no longer intact, and the realization settled heavier than any confrontation could have, because there was no clear opponent to push against, no argument to win, no accusation to deflect, only the undeniable presence of a reality that had evolved without him, and across the room, Claire paused near the edge of a conversation, her hand once again resting lightly against her abdomen, a small, instinctive gesture that now carried a different weight, not vulnerability, not uncertainty, but quiet certainty, as if she were grounded in something beyond the room, beyond the past, beyond him, and for a brief second, their eyes met again, not in challenge, not in unfinished tension, but in acknowledgement, and what passed between them was not the echo of what had been, but the clarity of what no longer was, and Ryan understood it then in a way he had not allowed himself to before, that she had not come back to prove anything, had not come back to reclaim, had not come back at all in the way he had imagined, she had simply moved forward, built something separate, something stronger, something entirely her own, and tonight was not her return, it was his realization, and that distinction changed everything, because there was nothing left for him to compete with, nothing left to diminish, nothing left to control, and as the evening continued around them, seamless and elegant and entirely indifferent to his expectations, Ryan remained where he was for a moment longer, not at the center, not at the edge, but somewhere in between, in a space that no longer defined him, and across the room, Claire did not look back again, because she did not need to, the story had already moved beyond him, and for the first time, he was not part of where it was going. The evening moved forward with the seamless elegance expected of a room built on wealth and reputation, but for Ryan, time no longer felt smooth, it dragged in uneven fragments, moments stretching longer than they should, each second forcing him to sit inside a realization he could not redirect, because no matter where he looked, the room no longer confirmed his version of reality, it reflected something else entirely. And he found himself watching Claire again, not intentionally at first, just a glance, then another, then longer than he meant to, as if trying to reconcile the woman he had once known with the one standing there now, and the difference was not in what she wore or how she carried herself, it was in what she no longer gave away. There was no seeking in her eyes, no quiet anticipation of approval, no subtle adjustment to fit the expectations around her. She existed without negotiation. And that unsettled him more than anything she could have said, because it meant she had rebuilt something he was not part of, something he did not influence, something he could not claim credit for shaping or breaking, and that loss of influence felt sharper than any argument. And beside her, Ethan leaned slightly closer, not in a way that demanded attention but in a way that suggested familiarity, a quiet exchange of a few words that did not need to be overheard to be understood. And Claire's expression softened just slightly in response, not performative, not exaggerated. Just real, and it struck Ryan then, unexpectedly, that he had not seen that version of her in a very long time, perhaps not even when they were together, because what he had once called composure had often been restraint, what he had interpreted as simplicity had been patience, and what he had dismissed as lack had been something he never took the time to understand, and now it existed without him, fully formed, undeniable. And across the floor, Sophie finally spoke again, her voice low but edged with something new, something less certain. "You did not tell me she was involved in this," she said, her words controlled but carrying enough weight to break through his thoughts, and Ryan turned toward her, instinctively ready to respond, to regain footing in a conversation he could manage, but the answer did not come as easily as it once would have, because the truth was not something he had prepared for. And anything less than truth would feel hollow in a room that had already shifted. "It's perception, I did not know," he said finally, and even to his own ears, the admission sounded unfamiliar, stripped of the confidence he usually wrapped around uncertainty, and Sophie studied him for a moment, not accusing, not confrontational, but assessing, recalculating her understanding of the man beside her in the same way the room had recalculated its understanding of Claire, and then she nodded once. A small movement that carried more distance than any dramatic gesture could have, as if something had quietly changed in her perception as well, and Ryan felt it, the subtle withdrawal, the shift from alignment to observation, and for the first time that night, he was no longer certain of his place beside her either. And across the room, Claire turned slightly as someone approached, another conversation beginning, another circle forming naturally around her without effort. And she listened, responded, moved through it with the same steady presence, her hand again brushing her abdomen in that quiet, instinctive way, grounding herself in something beyond the room, beyond the past, beyond him. And Ryan watched that gesture longer this time, understanding settling in pieces he could not ignore, because it was not just her life that had moved forward, it was everything connected to it, everything that now existed outside the version of events he had constructed. And the realization did not arrive as a sudden blow, it unfolded slowly, deliberately, leaving no space to deny it, and as the music swelled again, filling the ballroom with a renewed sense of rhythm, Ryan remained still for just a moment longer, standing in a place that no longer responded to him, no longer reflected him, and for the first time, he understood that this was not a moment he could recover from. Not because he had lost something in front of everyone, but because what he had lost had already been gone long before he walked into the room, and tonight had simply made it visible. The rhythm of the evening had returned, at least on the surface, the music swelling gently through the ballroom, glasses clinking in soft intervals, conversations weaving back into place as if nothing significant had occurred, but beneath that polished continuity, something irreversible had settled, something that could not be undone by laughter or distraction. And Ryan felt it in every glance that passed over him now instead of stopping, in every conversation that did not open space for him to step into, and he moved at last, not with purpose but with the quiet instinct to reposition himself, to find ground that still responded to him, though each step felt less certain than the one before. And as he reached the bar, the familiar scent of oak and citrus from the polished counter grounding him slightly, he ordered a drink he did not need, more out of habit than desire, something to hold, something to anchor his hands while his thoughts continued to shift in ways he could not control. And across the room, Claire remained where the current had carried her, speaking now with a small group that leaned toward her without realizing they were doing it, their attention drawn not by force but by the clarity of her presence. And Ethan stood just beside her, not overshadowing, not directing, simply there in a way that suggested alignment rather than control, and Ryan watched them longer than he intended again, unable to fully look away, because the simplicity of it unsettled him more than any display of power could have. There was no spectacle, no announcement, no need to prove anything, and yet the entire room had already adjusted around them. And beside him, Sophie finally exhaled softly, setting her untouched glass down on the bar with a quiet precision that mirrored the shift in her own demeanor. "This is not what I expected tonight," she said, not bitter, not upset, just stating a reality that no longer aligned with the image she had agreed to step into earlier that evening, and Ryan glanced at her, searching for something familiar in her expression, some reflection of the certainty they had shared when they arrived. But what he found instead was distance, not dramatic, not final, but unmistakable, as if she too had stepped slightly outside the version of the night they had constructed together, and he nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any explanation could, because there was nothing to explain that would restore what had shifted, and across the room, Claire's hand rested again against her abdomen, that quiet, grounding gesture repeating with a consistency that no longer felt incidental, and Ryan understood it now not as a detail, but as a center, something that anchored her beyond the room, beyond the past, beyond him, and the realization settled differently this time, not sharp, not defensive, but heavy in a way that did not invite resistance, because it was no longer about comparison or competition, it was about distance, about the undeniable fact that her life had expanded into something he could not reach, could not influence, could not even fully understand from where he stood, and for a brief moment, he considered crossing the room again. Considered stepping back into that space, saying something more, something different, something that might reclaim even a fragment of connection, but the thought dissolved almost as quickly as it formed, because there was nothing left to reclaim that she had not already released, and that clarity, quiet and absolute, held him in place more effectively than any confrontation could have, and as the evening continued to unfold around them, seamless and elegant and entirely indifferent to his expectations, Ryan remained where he was, no longer trying to move ahead of it, no longer trying to redirect it, simply standing within a moment that had already moved beyond him, while across the room, Claire did not look back, because she had nothing left to confirm, nothing left to prove, and nothing left to carry from the life she had already outgrown. By the time the string quartet shifted into a slower melody, the kind that softened the edges of conversation and invited a different kind of attention, the room had fully settled into its new balance, and what once felt like a performance now felt like observation, as if everyone present had quietly adjusted their expectations without needing to acknowledge it aloud. And Claire stood near the tall windows where the city light stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a reflection of something expansive and untouchable, her silhouette calm against the backdrop, her presence no longer something the room was reacting to, but something it had accepted as central, and Ethan spoke beside her in low, measured tones, his words few but deliberate, the kind that did not fill space unnecessarily, and she listened, not as someone being guided, but as someone fully equal in the exchange, her responses thoughtful, grounded, and unhurried, and for the first time that evening, there was a softness in her expression that had nothing to do with the room, nothing to do with the past, but everything to do with the life she had built beyond it, and across the floor, Ryan remained near the bar, the drink in his hand untouched, condensation forming slowly along the glass as time passed without his noticing, and he no longer tried to insert himself into conversations that did not open for him, no longer adjusted his posture to reclaim attention that had already moved elsewhere. Instead he watched, not with urgency now, but with a quiet understanding that settled deeper with each passing moment, because the difference was no longer just visible, it was undeniable, and Sophie, standing a few feet away from him now rather than beside him, had fully shifted her stance, her body angled slightly toward the room instead of toward him, her expression composed but distant, as if she too had stepped into a perspective that no longer aligned with the one they had shared when they arrived, and she did not speak again, not because there was nothing to say, but because whatever had needed to be understood already had been, and Ryan exhaled slowly, setting his glass down on the bar with a quiet finality that marked something internal rather than external, and his gaze returned to Claire one last time, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging, because what stood before him was not a version of the past he could revisit or reinterpret, it was a reality that had moved forward without him in every possible way, and for the first time, he did not try to reshape it in his mind, did not try to find fault or explanation or missed detail, he simply saw it as it was, complete, self-sustained, and entirely out of his reach, and across the room, Claire turned slightly as Ethan gestured toward the exit, not in urgency but in quiet suggestion, and she nodded, her hand once again resting gently against her abdomen as she took a final glance across the space, not lingering, not searching, just a brief acknowledgement of the environment she had stepped into and now stepped out of on her own terms, and as they moved toward the doors, the room did not stop them, did not call after them, did not attempt to hold them in place, because their presence had never depended on the room to begin with, and when the doors closed softly behind them, the absence they left was not loud, but it was felt, a subtle shift in energy that no amount of music or conversation could fully replace, and Ryan stood still for a moment longer, then turned away, not toward the center, not toward the crowd, but toward something quieter, something less defined, because the night he had expected no longer existed, and the one that remained was not his to control, and for the first time, he did not try to change that. Outside, the night air felt different, cooler, quieter, untouched by the curated warmth of the ballroom they had just left behind, and Claire paused for a brief moment at the top of the stone steps, the soft glow from the building casting a gentle outline around her as the distant hum of the city stretched out before them, steady and indifferent, and Ethan stood beside her, not rushing her forward, not filling the silence, simply present in a way that allowed the moment to settle naturally, and Claire inhaled slowly, the tension she had not acknowledged inside finally releasing in a quiet exhale, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just enough to mark the shift from one world back into another, and her hand rested once more against her abdomen, a grounding gesture that felt instinctive now, not protective but affirming, as if reminding herself of what truly mattered beyond the polished floors and measured conversations she had just stepped away from, and for a moment, she allowed herself to look back, not at the people inside, not at the space she had just left, but at the reflection in the glass doors, faint now, almost indistinct, a version of herself that no longer felt tied to the person she had once been, and there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction drawn from the shift she had caused, only a quiet steadiness, the kind that came from understanding that she had nothing left to prove, and beside her, Ethan spoke softly, his voice low enough that it blended with the rhythm of the night. "Are you all right?" he asked, not out of concern that something was wrong, but as a simple acknowledgement of everything that moment had carried, and Claire nodded, her answer just as calm. "I am," she said, and the truth of it settled between them without needing elaboration, because what had unfolded inside was not something she needed to revisit or analyze, it was simply a chapter she had already moved beyond, and as they descended the steps together, the city opened up in front of them, wide streets lit by rows of amber streetlights, the distant sound of traffic weaving through the night like a steady pulse, and it felt real in a way the ballroom had not, unfiltered, uncurated, grounded in something that did not depend on perception or approval, and Claire walked beside Ethan with an ease that had nothing to do with the presence of others, her pace unhurried, her posture relaxed, as if the weight she had once carried no longer followed her, and across town, far removed from the quiet clarity of that moment, Ryan remained inside the ballroom, though the space no longer felt the same, the music continuing as if nothing had shifted, the conversations resuming as if the center had not moved, but for him, the illusion had already broken, and he stood near the edge of the room now, no longer attempting to reclaim a place that had already slipped beyond his reach, his reflection faint in the mirrored wall beside him, sharper than before, more honest in a way that left no room for distortion, and he exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in defeat, but in a kind of understanding that arrived too late to change anything, because what he had seen that night was not something he could reinterpret or undo, it was a truth that had existed long before he recognized it, and as the evening carried on around him, seamless and unchanged for everyone else, Ryan turned slightly, his gaze no longer searching for Claire, no longer trying to locate something that had already moved beyond him, and for the first time, he allowed the moment to settle without resistance. Because there was nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to control, only the quiet realization that the story he thought he had ended had continued without him, growing into something he would never be part of again, and outside, beneath the open sky, Claire did not look back. The car door closed with a soft, deliberate sound that seemed to seal the night behind them, not as an ending, but as a quiet transition into something that no longer needed explanation, and as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, the glow of the ballroom receded into the distance, its polished lights fading into just another building among many, no longer the center of anything that mattered, and Claire leaned back against the seat, her gaze drifting briefly to the city passing by outside. The window, reflections of streetlights sliding across the glass in long, fluid lines, each one dissolving into the next without resistance, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just occurred, not as tension, not as relief, but as clarity, the kind that did not demand reaction, only acknowledgement, and her hand rested again against her abdomen, a quiet, grounding gesture that now felt less like protection and more like connection. Something steady and real beneath everything else, and Ethan sat beside her, his presence unchanged, calm and unobtrusive, as if he understood that. This moment did not need to be filled with words, and after a few seconds, he glanced at her, not searching, not questioning, simply aware, and she met his gaze with the same steady calm she had carried all night, but there was something softer there now, something unguarded in a way that had nothing to do with vulnerability and everything to do with trust, and he nodded slightly, as if that was enough. As if everything that needed to be said had already been understood without being spoken. And outside, the city continued its quiet rhythm, cars passing, lights shifting, life moving forward without pause, and it felt aligned with the pace she had chosen for herself, unforced, unhurried, entirely her own, and across town, in the lingering echo of the ballroom, Ryan finally stepped away from the edge where he had been standing for far too long, his reflection no longer holding his attention the way it had earlier, because there was nothing left in it to analyze, nothing left to reinterpret, and as he moved through the room, the familiar faces he passed no longer carried the same weight, their reactions no longer something he measured himself against, because the shift that had occurred was not something he could navigate or correct, it simply existed, and Sophie was no longer beside him when he reached the center again, her absence subtle but definitive, not marked by confrontation, not announced, just present in the space she no longer occupied, and he did not look for her immediately, not out of indifference, but because the instinct to manage everything around him had finally quieted, replaced by something unfamiliar, something closer to acceptance, and he exhaled slowly, the sound nearly lost beneath the music that continued without interruption, because the night, for everyone else, had not changed in any visible way, and yet for him, it had shifted completely, and there was no returning to the version of it he had expected, no reclaiming the certainty he had walked in with, only the quiet understanding that what he had witnessed was not a moment of loss, but a revelation of distance that had already been there, unseen until now, and outside, as the car turned onto a quieter street, the city lights softened, the noise faded slightly, and Claire closed her eyes for just a second, not out of exhaustion, but out of calm, a brief pause that held no weight of the past, no echo of the room she had left behind, only the steady presence of where she was now, and when she opened them again, she did not look back, because there was nothing left behind that belonged to her anymore. Morning arrived without announcement, the kind of quiet transition where darkness softened into light without asking permission, and the city outside Claire's window moved from shadow into clarity one building at a time, each glass surface catching the early sun in muted reflections that felt real in a way the night before had not, and she stood there for a moment longer than necessary, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the marble countertop, the other instinctively settling over her abdomen as if greeting the day not alone but with something constant, something grounding beneath the surface of everything else, and the stillness of the space around her was not empty, it was intentional, curated in a way that reflected a life built with care rather than performance, and behind her, the quiet sound of movement signaled Ethan's presence before he spoke, his footsteps measured, unhurried, as he crossed into the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, setting one beside her without interruption, without assumption, just an offering placed within reach, and she glanced at it, then at him, a small acknowledgement passing between them that did not require words to hold meaning, and outside, the city continued its steady rhythm, people moving, traffic building, life unfolding in ways that did not pause for reflection, and yet inside, the moment held, suspended in a calm that did not need to rush forward, because nothing about it felt uncertain or unresolved, and Claire took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth settling through her in a way that felt grounding, present, real, and for the first time since the night before, she allowed herself to revisit it, not the room, not the people, but the feeling of standing within it unchanged, unaffected, and she realized it had not been about proving anything, not about reclaiming something lost or rewriting a narrative. It had simply been a moment where her past and present existed in the same space long enough for her to see clearly that they no longer intersected, and that clarity did not bring satisfaction or regret, only a quiet sense of completion. And across the city, in a space that felt far less steady, Ryan sat at the edge of a chair that did not feel entirely his, the remnants of the night still lingering in the form of a suit jacket draped carelessly over the back, a glass left untouched on a nearby table, and the silence around him carried a different weight, not peaceful, not grounded, but reflective in a way that did not allow distraction, and he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, because there was nothing left to analyze that had not already revealed itself, and the realization that had begun the night before had not faded with time. It had settled, clearer now, less resistant, and he understood that what had shifted was not temporary, not situational, it was fundamental, something that could not be undone by effort or explanation. And for a moment, he closed his eyes, not to escape it, but to let it settle fully, without interruption. And when he opened them again, the room around him felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. And across the city, Claire turned slightly away from the window, the morning light catching softly against her features as she moved back into the quiet rhythm of her day, not carrying the night with her, not revisiting it, simply continuing forward with a steadiness that did not need to look back, because everything that needed to be understood already had been, and nothing about where she was going required anything from where she had been. The day unfolded without urgency, each hour settling into the next with a quiet consistency that felt earned rather than imposed, and Claire moved through it with the same steady rhythm she had built long before the night at the ballroom ever happened, her meetings precise, her conversations intentional, her presence carrying the same quiet authority that had shifted an entire room without effort. And yet there was something subtly different now, not in what she did, but in what she no longer carried, because whatever remnants of the past had once lingered in small, unspoken ways were no longer there, and that absence did not feel like loss, it felt like space, clear and unobstructed. And as she stepped out of a meeting late in the afternoon, the soft click of her heels against the polished hallway floor echoed gently around her, a familiar sound that no longer felt like something she had to match or measure herself against. It was simply part of her world, and Ethan was waiting near the end of the corridor, his posture relaxed, his attention steady as always, and when she approached, there was no question in his expression, no need to revisit what had already been understood, only a quiet acknowledgement of the present. And he gestured slightly toward the exit, a silent suggestion rather than a directive, and she nodded, falling into step beside him without hesitation, their pace aligned not out of effort, but out of something more natural, something that did not require adjustment. And outside, the late afternoon light stretched long across the street, casting soft shadows that moved slowly with the passing time. And Claire paused briefly before stepping forward, her hand once again resting against her abdomen, the gesture now as natural as breathing, not a reminder, not a shield, but a connection to something that was already part of her future. And for a moment, she allowed herself to stand still, not because she needed to, but because she could, because nothing behind her was pulling her back, nothing unresolved, nothing unfinished. And across the city, Ryan stood in front of a window that offered a view he had once found impressive, expansive, something that reinforced the narrative he had built about himself, but now it felt distant, disconnected, as if the glass between him and the city reflected more of himself than what was beyond it. And he watched the movement below without truly seeing it, his thoughts no longer circling around what had happened, but settling into what it meant. And for the first time, there was no instinct to correct it, no urge to reconstruct a version of events that placed him back at the center, because he understood now that there was no center waiting for him to reclaim, only a space that had already moved on. And he exhaled slowly, the sound quiet, almost unnoticed even by himself, and stepped back from the window, not in retreat, but in recognition that standing there would not change anything. And outside, Claire resumed walking, her pace steady, her path clear, the city opening in front of her not as something to conquer or prove herself within, but as something she already belonged to. And Ethan matched her stride without a word, the silence between them not empty, but complete. And as they moved forward, there was no sense of departure, no lingering attachment to what had come before, only the quiet certainty of what was ahead, and for Claire, that was enough. The weeks that followed did not announce themselves with dramatic change, they unfolded quietly, steadily, each day layering itself onto the next until what had once felt like a turning point became simply part of the past, and Claire no longer thought about the ballroom, not in the way one replays moments or searches for meaning, because there was nothing left there that required her attention. It had already served its purpose, not as a victory, not as a confrontation, but as confirmation. And that distinction settled into her life with a calm permanence that did not need to be revisited, and on a clear morning, sunlight filled the living space with a soft, even glow, reflecting gently across glass and marble, the kind of light that revealed rather than dramatized, and Claire stood near the window once more, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, her hand resting instinctively against her abdomen, not as a habit, but as something deeper now, something connected, something real, and there was no tension in her expression, no trace of what had once been carried beneath the surface, only a quiet presence that came from knowing exactly where she stood, and behind her, the soft sound of footsteps approached, familiar, unhurried, and Ethan paused beside her, not interrupting, not asking, simply sharing the space in a way that required nothing more, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was no need to fill the silence with words that would only repeat what was already understood. And outside, the city moved as it always did, cars passing, people crossing, life continuing without pause, and Claire watched it not as something distant, not as something to measure herself against, but as something she was already part of, fully, without question, and across the city, Ryan stepped into a different kind of morning, one that felt quieter in a way he had not noticed before. The familiar routine still present, the same spaces, the same expectations. But something within them had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way others could immediately see, but in the way he moved through them, slower, more aware, less certain of the narratives he had once relied on, and he paused briefly before leaving his apartment, his reflection catching in the mirror just long enough for him to recognize that what had changed was not the world around him, but the lens through which he viewed it. And there was no immediate resolution in that realization, no clear next step, only the understanding that some things, once seen clearly, could not be unseen, and he stepped forward anyway, not with the same certainty as before, but with something quieter, something more honest, and back in her world. Claire turned slightly from the window, the light shifting across her as she moved, and there was no sense of conclusion in her expression, no feeling of having reached an end, because what she had built was not defined by a single moment, it was continuous, evolving. Grounded in something that did not depend on who had once stood beside her or who had once walked away, and as she took a step forward, her path clear, her pace steady, there was nothing behind her that called her back, no unfinished chapter waiting to be rewritten, only the quiet certainty of a life that belonged entirely to her, and she did not look back, because she did not need to. Everything she had become was already ahead of her, and that was where she chose to stay.